We mentioned some political trends last time with nationalism and imperialism. The idea that some nations just simply think they're better than others, and imperialism, where larger nations exploit smaller nations. And one of the biggest reasons why is for natural resources. Another major trend at the time, too, militarism. Militarism is the buildup or the focus of a nation's resources on building up a strong military, a strong army, and a strong navy. And militarism is connected in some ways to industrialization and imperialism. If you are going to have factories that need these raw materials and produce these finished goods, then you need a capable means of transportation. And ultimately, nations taking raw materials from Africa and other underdeveloped parts of the world needed a safe way to get those materials out of Africa and back to Europe to those factories and then transport them to wherever they were going to sell them. And so the need for a military, particularly a strong navy, was great. You had to protect your investment. And ultimately, nations developed modern militaries in order to cope with that. They also understood that there are nations who are competing against them, not just economically, but for power and prestige in the world. And so militarism is another common theme. Now, strangely enough, another theme that you see is the spread of democracy. For quite some time, autocracies, where you had a czar or an emperor or a king, a monarch of some kind, that was the rule in Europe. And yet, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you're going to see democracy spreading. And some of that is at the behest of the United States, and some of it is just a natural outflow of people getting tired of an autocrat leading them into a dangerous situation. You'll see that by the end of World War I, major nations like Russia and Germany, who had long been ruled by autocrats, are going to change in terms of their government. They're going to see the people become angry, so angry that they're going to want a change of institutions. Not only that, but democracy spreads in part because of that inequality of wealth. People are tired of being exploited, and so ultimately they demand reforms to government so that they have more input and more value in what happens or what transpires. Many of the political decisions at the time were being driven by the interests of wealthy individuals and corporations, and people wanted that to change. Okay, let's talk briefly about cultural trends of the late 19th and early 20th century. You're going to see some big changes in art, music, and literature as well. One of the biggest changes is in terms of the art movement. What you see right here is one of Claude Monet's famous paintings, and it's part of a movement called Impressionism. All right, and Impressionism, you can see here, they're blurred brushstrokes that give you an impression of what's going on in this painting, not necessarily a clear view of it. Up until then, many artists were believers in the art movement called Romanticism, and that was emphasizing a realistic look. But that falls out of favor for a number of reasons, and one of which is the development of cameras. People didn't need an artist to paint a realistic picture anymore. You could simply go take a photograph and have a very accurate representation in just a few moments. And so the art movement changes dramatically. Claude Monet and other French artists are driving the Impressionist movement, which gets copied in a number of capacities or ways. So Impressionism is going to be a big deal around this time. And to give you another idea, part of the culture and part of the art and part of science as well, you get things built like the Eiffel Tower. You see the construction of the Eiffel Tower at the time, and this was something that was actually built as the crowning achievement for the World's Fair in 1888 in Paris, France. They wanted to build something to show what French society was capable of doing. It blends together art, design, science, construction, everything that a modern society wants to show off. And back then, the World's Fair was a gathering where ultimately every 5 to 10 years or so, countries would gather in a major city of the world, and each would bring their culture, their science, their art, everything that makes their society great. And so France, being the host country, wanted to show off what they could do. And these people at the time were the real rock stars of the era. Gustav Eiffel, the man who designs the Eiffel Tower, you see him here on the cover of a magazine. And if you just look at this image, you start to see how people viewed folks like Gustav Eiffel. Eiffel right here next to his tower, but notice he's a little bit taller, and you can see that his left hand is resting on the Great Pyramid at Giza, which is saying that his accomplishment dwarfs what the Egyptians did. You'll also notice there too, on his belt, it kind of looks like, it reminds me of like a walkie-talkie, but it's a cathedral, one of the major cathedrals of the era as well. And it's like, listen, of all the great accomplishments, Gustav Eiffel is definitely above and beyond. And so this is also the same time period where France gifts the United States with the Statue of Liberty. And in the United States, when they hosted a World's Fair in Chicago just 5 years after Paris, they needed something that would rival the Eiffel Tower as like a crowning achievement for the World's Fair. And they enlisted a man by the name of Ferris, who created a giant rotating wheel. That's right, folks, the Ferris wheel. We love them at carnivals today. Okay? Now, the art, the music, the literature of the time, the books were getting more into a realistic depiction of what life was like. People wanted a sense of what was going on in the world around them. And we want to talk about philosophers and thinkers as well, because they are going to be some of the preeminent writers. All right? One of the biggest writers of the time who's going to have an influence on the 20th century is Henry David Thoreau. This man is an American, despite it sounds almost like a French last name, but Thoreau is an American living in Massachusetts. And Thoreau did an extensive amount of writing and living on his own. And Thoreau, at one point, he makes this cabin. This is actually a recreation of his particular cabin. And Thoreau makes this cabin out in the middle of the woods in Massachusetts and wanted to go off and live by himself. He was a big believer in simplicity, living simply and being able to do things on your own, self-reliance. But while he was out there on his property in his little shack that he constructed, people began looking for him for various reasons, including tax collectors. And Henry David Thoreau was so annoyed that he refused to pay taxes. And his ideas for refusing to pay taxes came from something he referred to as civil disobedience. And that term is bantied about or thrown around pretty liberally these days. But what Thoreau was trying to say is that the civil government, just basically meaning the government itself, sometimes it was okay to disobey the government. There were certain situations where disobeying the government would be a good idea or the best idea, and that sometimes you should be able to look at the government and say no. Thoreau didn't have any idea at the time, but his ideas are going to be popular around the rest of the world. And we'll get to those later in the year, and I don't want to ruin this at the moment, but Thoreau's going to be the inspiration for several major world figures who say, look, sometimes the government gets it wrong. And this goes against what the preeminent thought at the time was, because in many instances, until democracy really starts to spread, a monarch or an emperor, ultimately, they were deemed to be in charge. They either had claimed that God had put them in charge, so you shouldn't question them, or that they had the force to stay in charge, meaning that they had an army behind them who would back up their authority, and that meant that they were right because they could simply push you around. All right? Now, we'll get